Morning. If you're just joining us, we're just going to wait for some others to join, so we'll get started shortly. Morning. If you've just joined us, we'll get started shortly, just waiting for some others. Okay, we will make a start. So good morning. Today we're going to be looking at effective strategies for dealing with employee sickness absence. Your speakers today are myself, David Seals, and my colleague Keith Potter. We're both from the Employment Department of Down Solicitors. We're going to be speaking for about 45 minutes, something like that. We'll do some questions at the end. So if you want to ask us a question, please do so. Pop your question in the Q&A box there that you'll see at the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best to answer those at the end. We're recording this as we normally do, but we turn the recording off when we get to the questions part. Okay, so sickness absence. This is a perennial problem for employers and for HR managers, and one we often get asked to give advice about, and people get us involved because there are some tricky legal issues. So hopefully in this webinar, we're going to go through some of the relevant issues that you should be thinking about if this is an issue for you, and hopefully giving you some guidance to steer your way through the problems. So what problems are caused by sickness absence? Well, the number one thing really is the knock-on effect on productivity. It's obvious, isn't it? If people aren't at work, they're not getting the work out the door, so they're not productive. But there's other problems as well. It can cause you planning issues. If you need to organise to cover for absences, that can cause real problems for employers. And it can place a strain on the rest of the team, either they've got to cover absences, or there may be a perception that some people are playing the system, and there's some abuse going on, and that can cause problems with morale in the team. So let's look at some general considerations before we get looking at how you deal with particular cases. So first, I just want to say something about consistency, and this area you really do need to think about treating staff consistently. This is something that we see across other areas of employment law, that if you don't treat people consistently, you can run into problems. And certainly in this area, you've got to think about it. So if you've got problems with people being absent, and you deal with it in a certain way, just be aware that you could be setting a precedent for later cases, which could come back to haunt you. So deal with staff consistently where you can. Pregnancy-related absences. Most people know that if people are off with absences that are related to pregnancy, you generally disregard those. Because if you don't, and you take action against someone due to absences caused by pregnancy, that could give rise to a pregnancy discrimination claim. Disabled staff. This whole area was really changed when they brought in the Disability Discrimination Act, 1995, and you can't look at this area without disability looming large in the background. So we will be touching on that as we go through this. Sickness absence policies. What I want to say about those is that you may have them, you may not have them, but there's things to be aware of. I mean, they are generally a good idea to have a written document that sets out what happens when people are sick, how you treat staff. But and the reason why they're good is because they ensure consistent treatment, or they encourage consistent treatment. Managers can see what they have to do. Staff are on notice as to how the employer will treat sickness absences in practice. So they're good from that point of view. Where they can be a problem would be if you've got them, but you don't follow them. That's going to be a real problem, because if there's a dispute and you're in a tribunal and you didn't follow your own written procedure, you can see that's going to be a very difficult situation you could be getting yourself into. So generally, yes, sickness absence policies, written policies are a good idea, but if you have them, make sure you follow them. Sick pay. With sick pay, this is an area where I just want to say something broad about this, which is that obviously sick pay is an important benefit for staff. It provides a safety net. If people are off sick, then they're going to get paid. They're not going to have that worry. So it's clear why you would have it. The downside of it, and I'm not saying this is something that generally staff do, but some staff may abuse it. So a lot of employers will have a policy, for example, on sick pay that is it's SSP only, or we pay additional sick pay at our discretion. And a lot of employers use that as a way of improving attendance, because they know that certain staff will abuse the system and take sick leave if they know there is this safety net that they will get 2 weeks or whatever it is a year paid sick. So that's just something to be aware of. Now, absence caused by the employer. Why I mention that is the case where you've got someone off sick, and maybe it's because of something that's happened at work. Say there's been an accident. Maybe you're got a warehouse or something, and somebody has an accident, and the employer is held to be liable for that accident. Well, that is relevant because we'll come on to long-term sick cases in a moment. But if the absence has been caused by the employer, then it's generally the case that the employer would probably be expected by an employment tribunal to expect perhaps more absence, more sickness absence as a case of that in a situation where the employer hadn't been the cause of the absence. So just something to be aware of. You may need to be a bit more lenient if you've actually caused the absence in the first place. A related point is the next one. Absence is caused by something other than the illness. And so what I'm talking about there is the scenario where you've got someone who is off and they're saying they're sick, but their real issue is perhaps they don't like the job, or they've got too much workload, or they're not getting on with their colleagues. I hope that's not pointing out the obvious, but you should look at those things and look behind maybe the reasons given by the employee for why they're off. They may be masking something else that you've not considered. PHI and medical retirement. So these are relevant if you've got a long-term sickness absence case, most probably. Now, you may or may not have these. PHI, permanent health insurance, is a policy that pays out where an employee is incapable of doing their job. And typically what they'll do is they'll provide regular payment of perhaps 50% or 2/3 of someone's salary whilst they continue to be incapacitated or disabled. You may have a policy as one of your staff benefits. If you've got that and you're dealing with a long-term sickness absence case, then you obviously need to look at that to see whether that employee could go onto that scheme rather than, for example, dismissing them. Similarly, medical retirement. Now, this is something that might be available on the occupational pension scheme that you're running. They tend to be attached more to final salary schemes, which of course have been dying out for a good many years now. So they're becoming less prevalent. But if you've got that possibility, then you should look at that. Okay, so if you don't look at either of those two things when you got them, you could have a problem if you dismiss someone without considering those. So moving on then to just talking about disabled staff. As you'll know, under the Equality Act, disabled employees are protected. And there's various types of claim that a disabled employee could bring under the Equality Act. And on the slide there, those are the ones that come up the most. So the most obvious one is this duty to make reasonable adjustments under the Equality Act. So be aware of that if you've got someone who's disabled and they're taking time off, and the absence is connected to their disability. The most common and obvious adjustment that you could see, that we see under the Equality Act, is really just expecting a higher level of absences from someone who's disabled than someone who's not disabled. So that's the adjustment you would, you most typically might see. But there could be other ones, such as, amending duties, redeployment, things like this. Other claims that are most commonly seen under the Equality Act where disabled people are concerned are discrimination arising from disability or indirect discrimination. So if you, for instance, dismiss someone, or you issue warnings to employees because of poor attendance, then those are claims that you could face, as well as a failure to make reasonable adjustments. But on those two claims, there is this defence of if you can show that it was a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, i.e. to dismiss or to issue a warning, then that would be a defence. So in other words, if you can justify what you've done, it wouldn't be discrimination. So turning to the different types of cases that we deal with, they broadly fall into two categories when we're talking about sickness absence. They don't always fit neatly into those two categories, but broadly speaking, this is what we're looking at here. And those are long-term absence cases and short-term intermittent cases. So the second one is more about a poor record over time. Long-term is usually something different with a long-term condition. So if we look at the long-term one first, so we are obviously talking about someone who's been off a long time, or they're going to be off a long time. And typically the kind of questions that the employer will need to consider when they're looking at action will be, how long has this employee been off sick? What is the prognosis? How long are they likely to be off for? They don't necessarily need to be to have been off for a long time. It may be that that they have a condition which means that they're going to be off for a very long time. You could actually take action fairly quick if you knew from the get-go that this was going to be a very long-term sickness absence case. The problem for employers is often the position is not entirely clear at the start, and they need to investigate, and it's obviously sensitive, and the information may not be immediately available. So your first port of call is going to be your employee. You're going to need to consult with them to find out what the issue is. Now, often employees are very communicative and helpful, and they give you the information, and it's absolutely clear what the situation is, and that can help you with planning. And it may be you can easily sort of decide what you're going to do. Other times, employees can be uncooperative, and Keith's going to look at that in a bit. Medical reports are something that might be required, not always, but often in a long-term sickness absence case, you are going to need some medical information from a doctor. And again, Keith will have a look at medical reports in a moment. If you are dealing with a long-term illness case, you should be thinking about things you can do to enable that person to come back to work maybe sooner than they otherwise would. So perhaps can you make adjustments to the job? Can you take away some of their duties? Can you make changes to their duties? Might you redeploy them somewhere else in your organization? These are all things you should be thinking about. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, is this a case where they really are going to be incapacitated for a long time, such that, and you've got a PHI scheme, so you should see whether or not they can move on to that, or the medical retirement, less likely if you've got that option under the pension scheme. Now, short-term intermittent cases are quite different. What we're talking about here really is cases where someone's just got a poor record. Their level of attendance is not satisfactory. It's not good. It's not good enough, and you need to improve it. Now, keeping records is important in all cases, but I mention it here because what we find time and again is that people call us up for advice on this, and they have employees with a poor record and they want to do something about it. But then when we ask them for details of what that poor record is, they haven't kept the records, and that's not very good, because clearly if you end up in a tribunal, you're going to need to show what the situation was and provide evidence. So keep good records. So, make people fill out self-certificates, even if they're off just for one day. Keep those records so you can see what the situation is. Now, return to work interviews are something that some employers use. So this is an interview you have with a member of staff immediately after they come back from a period of sickness absence, even perhaps if it's very short, even if it was one day. And I mean, ostensibly, I suppose, what you're doing is you're giving support, and you're seeing if there's anything you can do and so on. But in actual fact, very often this is a deterrent to be. If they know that they're going to get a return to work interview as soon as they come back to work, that is a disincentive to take sickness absence. It's almost as if, I don't want to take a day off because I'm going to have a grilling from my line manager when I get back to work. So maybe I've put that a bit harshly or inaccurately, but I think a lot of employers do use them in that way, and you can see why they do that. So if you're not doing that, maybe return to work interviews are the way to go, and could be helpful for you if you're seeing some poor absence, some poor attendance rather. Now, with short-term sickness absence, you need to do a bit of investigation. If you're seeing that people are taking time off sick, first of all, you should be thinking, is there a problem at work? I mentioned before that there might be something else, like they've just got too much workload, it's too stressful, or they're not getting on with colleagues, or they don't like their line manager, or something. Is there something like that going on? You need to just tick that box, make sure that you consider that. Is there an underlying condition? So if you've got the self-certificates, they should say why people have been absent. You want to look there to see whether there's a underlying condition. Maybe they're not having that much time off in itself, but there's something medically underneath that needs addressing. So, are they getting the right advice? Are they going to their doctor and saying, look, I am taking time off, is various things, but is there something underneath this that I need to be aware of? Is that being looked at? Is there a pattern? So people taking every Monday off or every Friday off, is there something going on here? If they've got a second job and they're taking the Friday off sick because they're tired from their job that they've got on a Thursday night. You need to be looking at these things. when to intervene, and consistency of treatment. Well, this is something that you will need to, depending on how big you are as an employer, you need to have a policy on it, and maybe you'll have a written policy, as I mentioned at the beginning. If you're a medium or large employer, you will probably have a policy on this, and maybe it will have triggers. So if people have been off for a certain number of days, or there've been a certain number of incidents of sickness, that will trigger you intervening. That's fine to have those policies, but as I said, you need to be thinking about consistency and making sure that you treat people reasonably the same, or you know, that could come back to bite you. Now, with the sickness absence that's intermittent, it's fine to issue warnings. This is almost a bit like a disciplinary procedure, whereby you're issuing warnings, they're getting more severe, and then ultimately they could be dismissed. That's the type of process that we're talking about with short-term intermittent sickness absence, because as the employer, you're able to set the standards. As I said, you must be consistent in how you apply them, but you can set the standards. And if people don't meet the standards, that's okay. You can issue warnings, and an employment tribunal will be happy if you've done that and you've issued the right warnings before you consider dismissal. And I'll look at dismissal at the end of the webinar. Now I'm going to hand over to Keith, and he's going to talk a bit about reports.
Thanks very much, David. Yes, yeah, as David has said, I mean, in any case where you're contemplating dismissal or some sort of action for long-term sick absence, you're always going to have to investigate the medical aspects that are causing the absence. And probably in the vast majority of cases, you're going to need a medical report. In cases involving persistent short-term absence, each case is going to be very fact sensitive. There is case law going back over 30 years now, which suggests that you may not always need a medical report in those cases. But that case law predates the disability discrimination legislation. So you always have to have that in mind now when you're dealing with either long-term or persistent short-term absence. So it's always worthwhile considering whether a medical report might be helpful even in a persistent short-term absence case. Now, you may be able to get a report from the employee's GP, but one of the effects of COVID over the last couple of years has been to place increasing pressure on GPs, and that has led to there being increasing delays in getting a report from a GP. And that means that if you want to get a report reasonably quickly, you will probably have to go to one of the companies that specialize in providing occupational health reports and have people who are qualified doctors or nurses but specialize in occupational health. And a report from that sort of organization is, well, likely to be more helpful because it will focus on the functional aspects of the person's condition rather than just looking at the purely medical ones, and also because you're likely to be able to obtain it more quickly. You also need to bear in mind that there could be a conflict between a report from an occupational health specialist and a GP. And the case law suggests that employers and tribunals are usually entitled to prefer an occupational health opinion to that of a GP. And that's partly because the occupational health report will focus on the functional aspects rather than the purely medical ones. But also, you have to bear in mind that a GP is likely to regard himself or herself as the patient's advocate, whereas the occupational health professional has a dual role in advising both the employer and employee. So there is a greater neutrality, if you like, associated with a report from an occupational health advisor. Your next slide, please. In every case, whether you're dealing with a GP or an occupational health professional, you are going to need consent from the employee for a report to be provided, because health professionals all have, they're all subject to a duty of confidence. So you are going to need to speak to the employee about your wish to obtain a medical report and to obtain the employee's consent. And you will also, it will also be sensible if you start that process by explaining to the employee why a reference is being made to, say, an occupational health provider, occupational health report provider. You may well find it easier to do that in the form of a letter to give to the employee at the end of a meeting to explain, so the employee has something in black and white to explain the background to the concerns that you have and the reasons why you got to the stage of wanting to seek a report. Now, it may be sufficient, probably in most cases it will be sufficient, if the employee says at the meeting, yes, that is satisfactory, that he's prepared to cooperate, as in most cases employees will, and you will then approach the occupational health provider, occupational health report provider, and they in turn will then write to the employee, probably using their own form, and will ask the employee to confirm his consent in writing, so that the consent in writing will be obtained at that stage. In terms of whether the employee should be entitled to see the occupational health professional report before it's provided to you, the employer, certainly the General Medical Council and the Faculty of Occupational Medicine both advise that an employee should be given access to an occupational health report before it's sent to the employer, and given a short time to withdraw his consent or to request changes to the report. They're only suggesting a time period of about 48 hours to be given to the employees. They're not a long period of time. And obviously the employee will not be entitled to ask the occupational health professional to change the medical aspects of the report, to change the advice on the prospects for return to work and that sort of thing. But if there are factual errors in the report, if the professional has misunderstood something, then that it will be helpful if things like that are corrected. There is legislation dating from the Access to Medical Reports Act in 1988, which gives rights to employees where reports, where medical reports about them are being sought, but that only applies to reports from doctors who have been responsible for the clinical care of the employee before the report is requested. And it's extremely unlikely that an occupational health professional will have had any responsibility for the clinical care of the employee. So in probably 99% or more of cases, that report, that piece of legislation will not apply to give any rights to employees where a report is being sought from an occupational health professional. Next slide, please. Now, just looking at the contents of an occupational health report, I said before that it's more likely to be helpful because it is going to focus on the functional aspects of, if you like, the functional effects of the employee's medical condition. It will look at what the employee can and can't do, rather than presenting the employer with a detailed medical diagnosis, which the employer doesn't need or want. It should focus on the prospects for improvement and a return to work if that exists, and also on the capacity, the employee's capacity to undertake some form of alternative work. It can also obviously give advice to the employer as to possible adjustments or adaptations that might be considered. And if the report does that, then it's down to the employee to consider whether those adjustments might be reasonable ones. It's not necessary, or indeed it's not really appropriate for the doctor to expressly give an opinion on whether the employee is disabled. And indeed, there was one fairly recent case where an employee was seen, I think, on about 3 occasions by an occupational health professional who did express the view that the employee was not disabled, and the employer relied upon that, only to find that when a claim was pursued in the Employment Tribunal for disability discrimination, the Employment Tribunal said that, well, we're not obliged to accept the occupational health advisor's report at face value, and we take the view that the employee was indeed disabled. So it's important to remember that the final view on whether a person is disabled or not is ultimately one for the Employment Tribunal and the courts, and it shouldn't be assumed that a doctor is going to express the last word on that particular subject. So, with that in mind, the occupational health provider should be asked to address the factual elements which determine whether an employee comes within the definition of being disabled within the Equality Act of 2010. So looking firstly at the question of whether there is a physical and mental impairment, answering the question, how long has it lasted, or how long is it likely to last? And then, does it have an adverse effect on the employee's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities? And if so, in what respects and to what extent? And is that effect going to be a long-term one? Now, the occupational health advisor may express a view on whether the effects are substantial or not, but it would be a mistake for the employer to, as I say, to think that that is the last word on the subject. The employer should really form its own independent view on whether the effects on the employee's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities, whether those effects are substantial or not, obviously taking into account the views of the occupational health advisor. I think it's really always been the case under the unfair dismissal legislation going back to the 1970s that an employer has an obligation to look at possible alternatives and adaptations, ways of allowing the employee to remain in work. But now that we've had the disability discrimination legislation since the 1990s, there's now obviously a statutory duty to consider reasonable adjustments in cases where it can be said that the employer has a provision, criterion, or practice, to use the language of the legislation, which has an adverse, or which puts a disabled employee at a substantial disadvantage. And where that situation arises, the employer now has the statutory duty under the legislation to look at ways of removing that disadvantage. So it is extremely important now for the employer to form a view about whether the employee comes within the scope of the disability discrimination legislation. And in borderline cases, the employer may well want to err on the side of caution and give the employee the benefit of the doubt and say, yes, on balance, we think you may be disabled, act accordingly. The next slide, please. Sorry, sorry, next slide, please, as well. So we've covered both slides. Sorry, next one as well, please. Move on to the next slide, please. I think, that's it. Yes, thank you. Looking at the difficult areas of disability, obviously there will be some cases where it is simply not obvious that the employee has a disability if it's not an obvious, visible one. Those are going to be cases where it's going to be particularly important for the employer to have the benefit of some medical advice. You need to consider that there may well be cases which have recurring or fluctuating effects. Those may perhaps particularly arise in the case of depression, anxiety, which is the cause of a very, very large proportion of employee absences, according to the most recent research, something of the order of approaching 50%, I think. It will be quite common for cases of depression to last perhaps for 3 or 4 months, and then for the employee to recover. That by itself will not necessarily cause an employee to fall within the category of being a disabled person. But if it can be said that the condition is likely to recur, then that puts a different light on the matter. It's a difficult judgment for the employer to have to make. Certainly, medical advice will be needed on that. The courts have said that when you're looking at the question whether a particular condition is likely to recur, you have to make the assessment exclusively by reference to what was known at the time. You can't, or the employee is not allowed to refer to subsequent events and to say, let us say the employee pursues a claim against the employer, and the case doesn't come before an employment tribunal for some months or years, and in the intervening period the employee has had further bouts of let us say depression or anxiety. The courts have said that the person is not allowed, the tribunal is not allowed to refer to subsequent events. The employer can only make a prophecy at the time as to whether or not the ill health, the depression, is likely to recur. Another difficult area is progressive conditions. These are conditions which may not immediately cause a substantial adverse effect on the person's ability to carry out day-to-day activities, but where they are likely to do so as the condition progresses. One recent example of a case was one where the employee had early onset Parkinson's disease, where at the time initially it did not have substantial adverse effect. It was having some effects, but not substantial ones. But the medical advice was that as the disease progressed, the effects were likely to become much more severe, and for that reason, the person did fall within the category of being disabled. Another particularly difficult area is that of cases involving what often described as invisible conditions, such as people with conditions falling within the autistic spectrum. Those will be cases, for example, where the person cannot cope with change or variety in the working environment and wants something that is constant and regular, or in every day. So a person, for example, in that type of situation may find it very difficult to cope with anything like hot desking. And there have been cases where, even involving employees and pursuing claims, arising out of their treatment. That is something where medical advice, I think, will be particularly important, particularly as to the types of adjustments and adaptations that may need to be made to help with to assist a person coping with that sort of disorder. It's also important to remember that you have to disregard any corrective measures that are being taken to assist the employee, and that doesn't just involve medication or prosthetics or something like that. It can also include cognitive behavior therapy or counselling. So if somebody is somebody suffering from, say, a depressive illness, is having cognitive behavior therapy or counselling, then the effect of that, the beneficial effects that may be having, have to be disregarded for the purposes of considering whether the person is disabled. Then you've got other conditions such as long COVID or the menopause. I know at least one trade unionist has argued that long COVID should automatically be treated as a disability. I think people generally wouldn't agree with that, but I think it is generally accepted that long COVID may cause consequences which do have a substantial adverse effect on the person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. It's pretty, it's really too early to judge at this stage because there haven't been any cases involving employees relying on long COVID side effects as a basis for disability. The menopause is also another example. It's a condition, obviously, that's received a lot of publicity over the last year or so. There's certainly been at least one case where a woman suffering from menopausal symptoms did pursue a claim, and I think was successful, because the employer in that case, the employer said, "Oh, I know all about menopause. My wife suffers from menopausal symptoms," and the employer took no evidence, took no medical evidence at all, and the result of that was that the employer was quite seriously criticised for not investigating the complaints that the woman made about the side effects of the menopause on her. Next slide, please. Looking at the process of instructing the medical advisor, it's really going to be important to provide as much detailed information about the background to the referral as the employer can. So the OHS advisor will want to know what the employee's job involves, and what the employer's experience has been of how the employee's attendance and ability has been affected by the medical condition that the employee suffers from. So you will need to provide details of the absence record, the reasons given by the employee for the absences that the employee has had. You need to explain what the employer has been told about the causes of absence and any medication taken by the employee, or any forms of medical treatment that the employees received. It used to be possible, it used to be relatively straightforward to get GPs to send a copy of the employer's medical records to an occupational health advisor for review. But the pressures on GPs I referred to earlier made this increasingly difficult. So increasingly, the occupational health advisor is going to rely on information supplied by the employer and obtained from the employee during the assessment. So the more information that the employer can provide about the background, the better. It's worth saying that many occupational health advisors are now conducting assessments via Zoom. It's not ideal, but it will normally allow an occupational health assessment to be made sooner rather than later. And given that the purpose of the occupational health report is functional rather than providing a detailed medical assessment, then a Zoom assessment is probably going to be good enough. So the occupational health advisor will need enough information to be able to make an assessment about what adjustments might conceivably be made to assist the person in getting back to work or to attend more regularly in future, as the case may be. And then, as I've said, leaving it to the employer to decide whether the suggested adjustments would be reasonable ones or not. Next slide, please. David alluded earlier to the fact that you will find some employees who are uncooperative and who will not, initially at least, refuse to attend for an occupational health assessment. Now, in those cases, you need to start by looking at what is said in the employment contract or the employee handbook, because many contracts and handbooks that I see do make provision for the employer to be able to request an employee to attend a medical assessment. But even if you don't have either of those things, that's not the end of the world, because in most cases, it will be a reasonable instruction for an employer to ask an employee to attend an occupational health appointment for a medical assessment. If the employee digs his or her heels in, then you wouldn't normally treat that sort of refusal as a disciplinary matter. And generally, the better course is to use the carrot rather than the stick approach, and to advise the employee of the consequences if he or she fails to cooperate, just making the point that non-cooperation is going to prevent potentially favourable matters being taken into account. And it will mean that the employer is entitled to say, well, I could only make a decision on the basis of the information that was known to me, the medical information that was known to me. And the employee prevented me from obtaining anything more detailed by the refusal to cooperate. The employer will certainly not be criticised if it makes reasonable attempts to obtain the medical evidence but doesn't get it. And the tribunal is likely to be very critical of an employee who is not cooperative. I'll hand back to David now.
Thanks, Keith. I'm just going to say a few words on dismissals and the risks around that, and then we're going to have a look at some questions. So if you're considering dismissing anyone for sickness absence, then first of all, just got to repeat again about disabled employees. Just because somebody has a disability doesn't mean that it's impossible for you to dismiss them. That's not the case. But you will, as we've been saying, have to make sure that you've made any reasonable adjustments before you make that decision. And you should ask yourself whether or not dismissal is justified in the circumstances. Is it a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim? It may well be if a person's been off for a very long time, or if someone's got a very poor record and you've given the warnings. So moving on, unfair dismissals. Now, as you probably know, you generally need 2 years service to claim unfair dismissal. So if you've got someone with less than 2 years service, it's probably not going to be an issue in most cases. But COVID has highlighted this section of the Employment Rights Act, Section 100, that deals with cases where people have stayed away from the workplace, for example, because they felt it was unsafe. And those kind of dismissals, that's an automatic right, day one right, so you don't need the 2 years service. So if you've got a case like that, you'd have to be careful. But generally, you need the 2 years to claim unfair dismissal. Now, capability is a potentially fair reason to dismiss. With unfair dismissal claims, there's a 2-stage test. First, was there a potentially fair reason to dismiss? Then you go on to the second stage. Was the employer acting reasonably in all the circumstances by treating that reason as sufficient to justify dismissal? So that first stage of the test shouldn't really be too contentious. In a case like this, capability will probably be accepted as potentially fair reason to dismiss. It's really the second limb of the test that is likely to be the background. So in terms of whether or not the employer acted fairly or not, it's going to depend on what kind of case it is. I was talking before about the difference between long-term and short-term cases. There'd be different considerations with both. Certainly in the long-term cases, did you establish the medical position? Was it clear what you were dealing with? Ultimately, in a long-term case, the question for the tribunal, what it boils down to, is how long should this employer keep this person's job open? And that can be a difficult question to answer. But generally, if the employer's established that a person's not going to be fit to resume work within the foreseeable future, then it probably would be fair to dismiss them. The other kind of cases, the short-term cases, is more about the procedure and whether or not the requisite warnings have been issued and the procedure followed. Now, before you dismiss anyone for this, clearly you're going to need to carry out a proper procedure in terms of having a meeting to consider the dismissal. The employee needs to be aware that you are considering dismissal and that they're given an opportunity to give reasons why you shouldn't and make their submissions. So you'll have to have that meeting. At that meeting, they should be allowed to be accompanied. As to who, well, that would normally be the standard trade union representative or work colleague. Now, if they're disabled, it might be wider than that. It might be a reasonable adjustment to allow someone else, like a family member or a friend, to come along. You'll have to look at that on a case-by-case basis. If you dismiss, then there should be a right of appeal against dismissal. And again, you'd have an appeal meeting and they'd have a right to be accompanied at that meeting. So you need to make sure all those safeguards are in place for any dismissal to be fair. That's what I've got to say on dismissals then. So we're just going to look at some questions now.